session marks the closing remarks for today's discussion, and we are honored to have Professor Rachel Harrison from SOAS University of London, who will share her thoughts on conducting interdisciplinary research in the environmental humanities. Dr. Rachel Harrison is a professor of Thai cultural studies at the SOAS University of London, and her research interests are in modern Thai cultural studies, Thai cinema and literature, gender studies, and reference to Thailand literary criticism and Southeast Asian literature in a comparative context. Okay, so without further ado, I now invite Professor Harrison to deliver her closing remarks.
Thank you, Ajahn Nantanut, for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this event, which is a real pleasure. And it's also very kind of you to wait until later in the afternoon for me to get up and be fully awake. So I really appreciate it. I was invited to talk about how to conduct interdisciplinary research in the environmental humanities. And the only reason that I have some experience of doing that is because of having had the pleasure to work with Ajahn Nantanut and Ajahn Atit in the past. Let me see if I can move the slide on. Sorry. So we were involved several years ago in a project with Ajahn Narong Kantikau from Khon Kaen University. And this talk is really dedicated to Ajahn Narong because very sadly he passed away 2 years ago. And it's a great loss to the scientific community and actually to the project of interdisciplinary research. Ajahn Narong was an amazing liver surgeon, but he was also absolutely dedicated to public health. And his work as someone from the northeast of Thailand, from Isan himself, was involved in diagnosing and treating liver cancer, or rather bile duct cancer, that came as a result of people eating raw and undercooked fish in the region that he grew up in and was part of. And he decided that the process of treating the disease through surgery was simply not enough to combat the huge numbers of cases of bile duct cancer that he was seeing, and instead sort of turned to also dedicating himself to early diagnosis, which he did through raising money from the Crown Property Bureau to get ultrasound equipment that he could use to provide ultrasounds for as many villagers as he could possibly have signing up to this. And his ultrasound clinics were able to provide early diagnosis of signs of bile duct cancer so that it could be treated before it was too late to treat. So it's a huge loss. Although his project of CASCAP continues with his colleagues, it was a huge loss to the medical community and also to the community of interdisciplinary research that he should have passed so early. So this is really in dedication to the amazing work of Ajahn Narong, and we all really loved working with him because he was an incredibly nice person to work with and very calm and patient, and had many of the attributes that are absolutely essential to doing interdisciplinary research, which requires an open-mindedness to other perspectives and an ability to listen to other perspectives and to take on board how other people see things. So this is our huge interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary team. There's Ajahn Narong on the steps of SOAS. And I can just run through the range of disciplines that we had in this team. I can find Ajahn Atit here, who's working in the field of film studies and religious studies. There's Ajahn Nantanut from English literature and post-colonial studies. We had Ajahn Sawani from Ubon, who is a sociolinguist. We had a couple of anthropologists, Ajahn Wisit, is it? Wisit, yes. Yeah, who is, I think of his nickname as O, Adan Wisit, who's an anthropologist, also Eduardo Ciani, who's an anthropologist. We had Alan Ziegler, who's a human geographer. We had Adan Janit here, who is also working in the field of literature and Thai studies. We had Ajahn Chachai, who's a historian. And then we had our medics at the back, Ajahn Narong and his team of medics, and Mike, who's a medical student, and then Pierre Eschobar here, who is an ecologist, an environmentalist. So we put all these different disciplines together, and I won't pretend that it was easy. We had enormous difficulty in hearing each other's perspectives, which was partly why we brought in Leon Redler, who was a trained mediator and psychotherapist, because we really needed help and support in thinking about how to be as open-minded as possible in order to listen to different perspectives. So that's our multidisciplinary team dealing with the question of how we might be able to engage with the communities that were eating raw and undercooked fish products and had been doing so for centuries, and how we might be able to kind of engage with them from different perspectives to think about whether it was a good idea for them to continue doing this if it produced such a high risk of bile duct cancer. So here we are in Yasothon province, and I'll talk about this slide a little bit later. The research that we did initially in Yasothon and in other areas of northeast Thailand was in the immediate aftermath of the passing of King Rama IX in October 2016. So this is the context in which we were working. And we were working with communities who had for centuries been surviving through fishing practices, so growing rice and fishing for fish in the Mekong River and the areas around the Mekong River. So the particular problem that we were dealing with was the fact that many of the fish that people were catching were what's known as cyprinid fish or white-scaled fish, fairly small freshwater fish, not farmed, but readily available and therefore a cheap source of protein, which many people were eating, particularly on special occasions, eating in a raw fish dish called goipla, where the fish meat is chopped up with herbs and spices and mixed with fish sauce and lime juice to produce an absolute delicious delicacy, a delicacy that is renowned not just for its taste, but also its texture. So the idea of preparing this in a different way that was um, that was cooked to kill the parasites in the raw fish was an anathema to the people who had been eating it for so long. The fact that this raw fish dish was bad for people's health and could lead to cancer actually made international news. So the BBC, for example, BBC correspondent in Thailand, Jonathan Head, covered this with very sort of scary headlines, a deadly dish that can give you cancer. It made the New York Times and other kind of international media. So not just a local concern, but also an international one, where the World Health Organization had stepped in to say that the liver fluke that appears in this raw fish dish is a class 1 carcinogen. Therefore, for as far as the scientific community and medical community is concerned, an obvious target for public health campaigns, because quite often people suffer from cancer, but it's hard for scientists to know exactly why the cancer has been caused. But in this case, in the case of bile duct cancer, and you're seeing a bile duct here with cancerous cells. In the case of this particular cancer, as far as the medical community was concerned, it was absolutely clear to them that it was caused by the effect of eating raw fish that was contaminated with liver fluke. And the liver fluke was living in the bile duct for 15 to 20 years, causing chronic inflammation, which was in some cases then turning into cancerous cells. So as far as medics were concerned, their issue was, we know what's causing the cancer. We don't want people to die of cancer. Therefore, they should stop eating the fish. It was a very simple medical issue as far as they were concerned. And the problem for them was the human element. Why do people do things which puts their health at risk? And the complexities of this were, for me, made very clear when we had the initial conference in Kongen with the medics and brought in all our different sort of social science and humanities perspectives. And the doctors became rather frustrated with us on many occasions because we asked lots of questions about context and human behavior, particularly from an anthropological perspective, the long-standing kind of discussions in anthropology about the difference between eating raw and cooked food were extremely irritating to the doctors, who simply wanted a kind of a human explanation of why people do things so that we could stop doing it. And then one of the epidemiologists got up from the table and went out to the front of the conference room, out into the hotel courtyard to smoke a cigarette. And for me, that the irony of human behavior became incredibly clear about why humans often do things which are bad for them. We know that smoking cigarettes causes cancer, and we know that drinking alcohol is not good for your liver, but there are plenty of members of the medical community who also do these things. So it's complicated. In our multidisciplinary approaches to trying to solve this problem, I think it was quite clear that the medical community wanted us to find a way of telling people not to do something that was bad for them. And after many kind of sessions and workshops, I think we found it more and more difficult to be able to offer a resolution to the problem in that way, because we began to realize that there were lots of reasons why people were doing what they were doing. And if you didn't get to the bottom of why people were behaving in the way that they were and didn't respect why they were behaving in the way that they were, then there was not going to be a solution to this at all. So one of the issues that we recognized quite early on was that there was something of a kind of social division between, not only between scientists and the medical community, but also between academics and the kind of human subjects that we are often engaged in researching on rather than working with. And I have to say that Ajahn Narong's approach to this was very refreshing, because having witnessed him doing the kind of ultrasounds, he was very engaged with the people that he was treating and was able to speak to them in a very sort of non-hierarchical way. But this didn't get around the problem that the social structures, whether we're talking about Thailand or the UK, suggest a class difference between the medical community and academics and many of the people who go for treatment in hospitals and doctors' surgeries. So I found this YouTube clip, which the quality, I'm going to play it, but the quality is very poor. Luckily, it has huge, big English subtitles. And if you're interested, you can find it on YouTube. But this is a really good indication of how public health campaigns have been directed from a top-down perspective to tell people what to do and what not to do, that is simply not very effective. So if you bear with me, I will stream this and hopefully you'll see enough of it to make sense of it. Now, where's the button? Okay.
แล้วกินเหล้าเลิกเหล้าทำงานทำงานทำงานเก็บเงินทำงานเก็บเงินใช้หนี้ทำงานเก็บเงินได้เรียนมีกินช่วยเหลือผ่องใสมีรักได้ขึ้น ไม่ป่วยรวยปัญญาพัฒนาฉลาดชาติเจริญไปถึงไหนก็ไม่รู้แค่เลิกเล่า
So it's really interesting, the final phrase is, it's so easy. All you need to do is stop drinking and you'll become, in a matter of 15 seconds, an upstanding Thai citizen who can be a representative of the nation, wearing a red shirt, the color of the nation. So this idea that you could simply transform behavior in that way is very problematic and actually probably quite ineffective. And I did notice that one of the logos on this at the end is suggesting that people should do this pour part for the king, as a dedication to the king. And that was very much part of the kind of advertising process for some of the public health campaigns, as a way of drawing people into getting them to buy into behavior change. So the kind of top-down process of health campaigns is something that we thought about quite a lot in the interdisciplinary project we did. And this particular image, I think, is quite an interesting one. I found this in a children's cartoon book that for public health that was issued not long after the military coup in 2014, where a teacher goes into a village and says, this is where people are consuming food that is contaminated with parasites. And this character here, the military character, says, let's take on the parasites and see what these evil creatures are doing. So it's very much a sort of top-down approach, which sees public health as a battleground. And I'd invite you also at the end of this presentation to think more about what's going on in this slide, because there's some very interesting dynamics, I think. But certainly the idea of information delivery as far as public health is concerned seemed to be very much a kind of top-down process. So here in the ultrasound clinic that Dr. Narong had set up in Yasothon, after having their ultrasounds, people were sent out to a long table where they were given information about the result of their ultrasound. And they were sort of categorized into being sort of fine to go home, or having early signs of bile duct cancer and needing further investigation, or they were told about other things that might be wrong with them that the ultrasound had picked up as well. But again, this process of delivering the information is a very nuanced one, which requires not just information delivery, but also the ability to listen back to what people are saying. So the top-down information delivery came at the school level. Here is Ajahn Narong's team giving information to the school children in the same site, and to the public health workers here sitting in the back row. One of the ways in which they gave information was by getting people to wear t-shirts saying, we don't eat raw food. So a stigmatization of a cultural process, of a cultural behavior that in some ways demonizes a kind of cultural behavior that people have been engaged in for many centuries. So you can get people to stop doing things through a fear factor, but it isn't the only way in which you can engage in behavior change. We found also particularly that in this campaign where the officials and community hierarchy were saying, we don't eat raw food. This is this slide here. We don't eat raw food. We get people to eat food which is sup. The word here, sup, which literally means cooked. And here it says sup is delicious. Cooked food is delicious. Unfortunately, a shortcoming with this is that traditionally when people prepare the goipla, the raw fish dish, they squeeze lime onto the dish, which in their view changes the color of the fish and therefore makes it, in their terminology, sup. So even the use of terminology here is problematic. because squeezing lime on the fish might change its color and might make it look cooked, but it doesn't kill the parasite. So what needed further explanation was the idea that you needed to cook it with heat, not cook it with lime. So language really comes to matter. It becomes very important. Another way in which people were encouraged to engage with public health campaigns was through entertainment. And this famous singer, Mike, whose own father had died of bile duct cancer, was engaged in the campaign to get people invested in the public health campaign. He'd done this by producing his own kind of fermented fish sauce, nampara, in bottles, hygienic bottles, called Sap Mike, delicious Mike bottles of fish sauce, which were given for free here because part of the problem was that some of the factories were producing fermented fish sauce that hadn't been fermented for long enough and still had liver fluke contamination. So when we were at the Yasothon ultrasound event, we thought that one of the things that was missing in this top-down public health campaign, where people were invited to listen to experts of different types, was that we were not listening back to them. And part of the multidisciplinary approach that we thought was very important was the fact that the voice of the people who were the object of this campaign was missing. And we weren't hearing enough from their own perspectives about what really mattered in their day-to-day decision making. So we spent time listening to them and thinking about what they were saying. And that led us to the conclusion that there are a range of different factors involved in dealing with a particular kind of, in this case, a particular medical problem. And the multidisciplinary approach is important because it positions itself in order to take into account the multiple factors at play. So this may be a medical problem, but the solution is not simply a medical one, and one has to take into account a range of different factors, including historical and political complexities. So for the multidisciplinary medical, social science, humanities approach, the intersection of different contextual complexities has to be considered from an overall view and from a bottom-up perspective. So here's an image of the Sukhothai inscription that was discovered in 1833, but dates back to 1292, discovered in the ancient city-state of Sukhothai. And why it matters is that there is a very famous line in this inscription that's considered as a sort of founding statement about Thai culture and the abundance and fertility of the Thai land, that there is water, in the water there is fish, and in the fields there is rice. There is always an abundance of food under the protection of a benign leader, a benign monarch. So the fundamental basis of the key elements of the Thai food being fish and rice goes back into history. And that matters because it matters to help understand how eating behavior and food behavior and agricultural behavior are so deeply rooted if you can date them back this far. And if they're deeply rooted, they have deep cultural roots, it's very difficult to change that behavior. So the idea of fishing for food is absolutely fundamental way back in time. Other historical features matter as well. So if you look at the way in which the modern Thai state came into being at the end of the 19th century, under the kind of pressure of colonial intervention from both the British and the French, you can see that in the modernizing moves of King Rama IV, V, and VI in the invention of the Thai nation state, Bangkok becomes the new center of power. The Bangkok elite become the powerful voice, and that very much remains the case. And the centralization of the Thai nation state brings in outlying regions with a rather colonial model. In fact, one can refer to it in some ways as auto-colonization or as internal colonization. The effects of this are that areas like Northeast Thailand or Isan are centralized, as anthropologist Charles Kai says, leading to a radical devaluation in the current political order as it existed in large parts of the population of the country. The peasantry in the northeast of Thailand therefore found their freedom of action increasingly restricted by Siamese officials. This also matters as historical context, because when you have a public health campaign that strikes at the core of cultural practices in a particular region of Thailand, and much of that public health campaign is considered to be top down and coming from the center, then it's pretty clear that you will encounter patterns of resistance, of forms of post-colonial resistance, if you will. And that post-colonial resistance to public health messages may not be to the advantage of the people who continue with unhealthy practices, but in a way that doesn't matter, because political posturing and post-colonial response becomes more important than looking after one's own individual body. So one might be engaged in performances that are detrimental to yourself, but still have a political significance. I remember when we were talking to people in Yasothon at the ultrasound clinic, one man in the queue for the ultrasound said, "I'm absolutely fed up of people telling me not to eat raw food. It makes me want to eat raw food, breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day." So that's the kind of response that you get if you map out a resistance to a top-down campaign. And it becomes part of a political resistance as well. So in the time that we were doing this research, many of the areas that we were working in Northeast Thailand were staunch red shirt supporters of Thaksin and his party, Pheu Thai. And they were also therefore pitted against the forces that were predominant in the center in Bangkok and the outlying areas. So there was a political dimension to their resistance to being told what to do as well. And this played into a kind of depiction of northeastern Thai villagers as being stupid, often depicted as red buffaloes. Here in this cartoon, the red buffalo is hugging an image of Thaksin. They are hand in glove together. And in the street protests where villagers from the northeast went down to Bangkok to protest, cartoons from the Bangkok center alluded to the fact that there were no more traffic jams, but the streets were crowded with red buffaloes instead. So the kind of demonization of the very people who were engaged in these food practices made it more complicated to think about ways in which you could address their traditional food eating practices, but still demonstrate a sense of respect for their culture when their culture was being roundly disrespected in the political domain. Our role as people working in the humanities was particularly to think about the way in which we could engage the arts in this project. So we thought about how we might bring in cinema, for example, which is a field that many of us are working in. I thought of the work of the filmmaker who's probably best known is the best known Thai filmmaker outside Thailand for sure, Apichatpong Weerasettakul, whose particular way into this is very interesting for what we were thinking about. He's best known for his film Uncle Bun Mi, which won the Cannes Film Festival Palme d'Or in 2010. But his work is particularly interesting for us because he was the son, or is the son, of two doctors who worked in northeast Thailand, in the very area where we were seeing these very high rates of bile duct cancer. And many of his films have scenes where there's an encounter between doctors and patients. And those encounters absolutely illustrate the very problem that we also identified, which is that there's a disconnect between doctors and patients, where the scientific explanation of behavior doesn't map onto people's lived experience of the world. And there's this wonderful clip from Syndromes of the Century where a doctor is examining an aged Buddhist monk, and she's trying to explain to him in medical terms what his problem is, and he has a completely different explanation. Also, she's preoccupied by the fact that the caretaker at the hospital owes her some money. And so when the caretaker walks past the window, she stops the consultation and walks out to get her money back. So there's also a kind of indication as well that she's not really listening. And this disconnect to me spoke volumes about the kind of difficulties that are faced by an interdisciplinary project. So if you will allow me the time, I'll just show this clip because it's quite wonderful, really.
ตาจะมาเป็นไรครับหมอ
คือหมอจะดูปฏิกิริยาตอบสนองของสมองหลวงตาค่ะว่าปกติหรือเปล่า
สมองของตาเหรอ
ค่ะ ช่วงนี้หลวงตาฝันบ่อยไหมคะ
อ๋อก็ไม่รู้เหมือนกันนะหมอตั้งแต่อาตมาตกจากเตียงวันก่อนนะอาตมาก็เป็นอย่างนี้นี่แหละ
เป็นปวดขา
ปวดขาแล้วมันตามข้อทำขานี่ครับ
ค่ะ
คืออย่างเนี้ยอาตมาฝันเห็นฝูงไก่อาตมาก่อนเป็นเด็กนะเป็นหนุ่มเล็กๆอ่ะซนหน้าดูใจร้ายมากๆเลยเอาไก่มาหักขาเลยอาตมาไปเที่ยวบ้านเพื่อนของที่สวนนะอาตมาหักขาไก่เขาเพราะมันส่งเสียงหนวกหูหักมันเล่นสนุกกันนั่นน่ะเนี่ยในฝันของอาตมานะฝันพวกไก่นะมันบอกอาตมาว่า อยากให้อาตมาทรมานทั้งที่อาตมานะสวดมนต์แผ่เมตตาให้พวกมันตั้งหลายปีมาแล้ว
หลวงตาคุยกับไก่รู้เรื่องด้วยเหรอคะ
ก็คือจิตวิญญาณของไก่มันมาจากเขาสิงกับอาตมาไปอย่างนั้นนะแล้วพวกมันก็แต่จะคิดจะล้างแค้นอาตมานะอาตมาก็วิ่งหนีดิพวกมันก็วิ่งตามบินตามไปเรื่อยๆอาตมาตกใจรู้สึกว่าตัวเองก็มีปีกกายเป็นไก่ไปด้วยอาตมาธรรมดานะอาตมานอนตะแคงนี่นะกอดหมอนข้างนี่นะในฝันนะอาตมาก็ฝันตื่นขึ้นมาเนี่ยฝันพวกไก่มันบินไล่อาตมาตกจากเตียงนะมันไต่อยู่บนพื้นเนี่ยอาตมาปวดมึนไปหมดตามข้อตามมือเนี่ยตามขาตามเท้าเนี่ย
แล้วตอนนี้ยังปวดอยู่ไหมคะหลวงตา
ก็มีบ้างอ่ะมีปวดอาจารย์มาถึงได้มาหาหมอเนี่ย
หลวงตาฉันไก่เยอะไปป่ะคะ
ว่าเยอะก็เยอะอาตมาน่าจะเลิกจะฉันได้แล้วนะเพราะจะได้ไม่มีกรรมซ้ำซ้อนนะเพราะอาตมาไปบิณฑบาตนี่นะเขาถวายไก่มาเนี่ยอาตมาก็ต้องรับ
ซึ่งหลวงตาคะเดี๋ยวรอหมอแป๊บนึงนะคะ
จะไปไหนอ่ะหมอ
หมอจะไป
เช็คร่างกายยังไม่เสร็จเลยนะหมอเนี่ย
เดี๋ยวหมอจะไปห้องข้างแป๊บนึงค่ะโทษนะคะ
Okay, I'll stop it at that point. But I think it illustrates the view that the kind of local knowledge explanation of why the monk's legs ache and why they actually ache is very different. So how do you find a language that makes sense to both sides, where both sides can communicate? There are other films that deal with environmental disaster and public health. Films like By the River by Nontawat Nambenchapon, that looks at the kind of lead poisoning of the Kitty Creek and some of the and plenty of other films that I don't have time to talk about now, but that we will be thinking about with the project that we're about to begin this time. But filmmaking led us to think about whether that was a way of inviting the people who were the subject of these public health campaigns to express their own voice. Because if you interview them either as medics or as academics, there's still a division, a class division, if you will. So we found that with talking, when the doctors were talking to people, people would say, yes, I'm not going to eat the fish again. I understand what you're saying. I won't do that. And then the doctors would leave and people would, of course, go back to eating the raw fish. So we wondered about whether there was a way of helping people to have tools where they could express their own views and do that through grassroots filmmaking. So we had a project back in Kontgen where we invited 3 or 4 groups of people to make their own films, not about fish and raw fish eating, because we thought that was too hot a topic, but just to ask them more widely about how they felt about food and nutrition and the pleasure of eating and what came across there. And I'm going to go out of the PowerPoint now because Ajahn Atit is going to show the film that this group of people made. There's our colleague from Sanchai from the Thai Film Foundation with his school cinema T-shirt on. He was fantastic at getting these people together, showing them how to put a film together, what to film, how to edit, and so on. And we're going to show you the result of what came up as out of that. So I stop sharing my screen here. And Ajahn Atit, are you able to screen the film?
Okay, just 1 second. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
See if I can go back into the PowerPoint. Okay, there we go. Share. Okay. Thank you. I mean, it lost a little bit, I think, in the streaming. But it's amazing that these villagers kind of made the film all together from scratch, filming on their smartphones, and editing themselves, and they designed their own song and they cooked food, and they really kind of engaged in the whole process. It was very, very rewarding, I think, and a lot of fun. And it was also interesting how the dynamics of the group mapped out as well. And it was quite interesting from a gender perspective how the only man in the group got really sidelined because all these ladies were really quite sort of dominant. So that's the link. We carried on with the grassroots filmmaking last year as well, and we did some projects in Grubi with fishing communities, making films about their relationship to their own environment, particularly to mangrove swamps, for example. This lovely group of teenage villagers from an island that was disconnected from the mainland made a short film about the importance of litter collection and keeping their own environment sort of clean and tidy. And this man made a film about his beekeeping practices, and he mapped out the land that he was farming and showed us how each of the kind of areas of the farm produce different kinds of crops and produce. So pretty much on time, I'll wind up with some conclusions. One is that interdisciplinary research requires a range of different skills and compromises. The compromises are really important. I think they require a great deal of humility from all concerned to be able to make those compromises. And sometimes that's not something that's in abundance in academia. And there should be another bit here. Yes. Also requires the ability to listen and to learn from the bottom up, getting rid of top-down dynamics and really sort of thinking about how you listen carefully, not only to what people say, but what's implied by what they don't say. So I'll stop there and very happy to take questions and open it up for conversation.